What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Outlier podcast. We have our fan favorite it's like a mini Green Hulk. It's like similar color, but we got Doomberg back to talk about the markets, the economy, some geopolitics probably. It's great to see you.
Hey, Eric, great to be back. I bring the green, you bring the muscles. So I guess between the two of us, we probably can get one Hulk out of the two of us.
You could be. Wouldn't be a good looking Hulk with me in it, but you know. So we've been catching up, like every quarter or so, just touching base on how things are going. And I thought it would be a really great spot to start with your current broad analysis of the US landscape, specific thinking about economy, energy, markets, any of those. If you want to dive into one, surface level on another, totally cool. I just want to start with what are you seeing from your view? What's most interesting to you?
Sure. Obviously, a lot going on. One of the challenges of being an analyst in the Trump era is the speed and violence of the news cycle. Really, every day is a new story, and much of macroeconomic analysis is really measuring flows, and netting out the flows can be really challenging if there's a lot of flows, right? And so in February, our industrial context started raising alarm about recession, supply chains seizing up on just the threat of tariffs. Basically, that's a really important signal in our view. And then one of the challenges of measuring the government data, which is actually really where I was going with this, is because people are front running things, you're going to get wild measurements across multiple data, like people front running the tariffs. All of a sudden you see a soaring imports. Well, that affects the measured GDP number. Does it really reflect authentic, sustainable economic activity? Liberation Day happened, shocked everybody. Trump is playing his hand. He has one card to play, which is to get as much of his agenda done as quickly as possible, rip the Band-Aid off, while he still has political capital. He needs to have the economy turning around and on the upswing by next summer. And the gamble is that a combination of tariffs, tax cuts, foreign direct investment, and cheap energy prices will be enough to catalyze a manufacturing boom in the US. The big question is whether he can bridge between the clearly unworkable, unsustainable old state and a disputable whether it would be workable new state. But to be fair to Trump, it's exactly what he campaigned on, and he's kept his promises to a T. And so it's a fascinating thing to watch. His trip to the Middle East was actually quite remarkable. And in our own private investing, we're seeing the beginnings of a huge wave of interest from sovereign wealth funds to capitalize investments that have a manufacturing base or the potential for one in the U.S. And that will create a boom. It will, with all booms, there will be frauds and, people who lose a lot of money and people who make fortunes. And so it's just really hard. So, but I would say on the energy side, which is what we care about the most and read about the most, Trump has declared that he wants $50 oil, and he seems likely to get it. And the Saudis seem willing to help Trump pull it off. I think it matters far less to Russia now than it would have if we had pursued that strategy three and a half years ago. But that's my sort of overall view. Energy is cheap. Money is flooding into the U.S. Tariffs are a bit of a mess. That's the way Trump operates. There's almost always a master plan. It's not always clear. And just as we were joking before you hit record, as fascinating and frustrating a person that you can imagine trying to cover when you're writing a newsletter with a 4-day editorial cycle.
As you were going through that, I literally have 6 questions that I need to follow up with you on. I'll go in order. The first one, you mentioned early on in that the macro analysis that you guys do. And I imagine it's such a difficult system to accurately forecast with how many variables come in and how fast things change, especially with how everything is going today. How do you manage that?
So first of all, nobody bats 1,000, and you have to begin the management of that with humility. We try to communicate to our subscribers that we are lateral thinkers, and you don't come to Doomberg for traditional straight news, who, what, when, where, why, fact-based reporting. You come to Doomberg to be provoked. You come to Doomberg to think, and you come to Doomberg hopefully for at least one good chuckle a piece. And that's our brand ambition. We will be provocative without being polarizing. We will be funny without being silly, and we will teach without being self-indulgent. Lateral thinking requires that you have the ability to not have to know why a model is working and trust that it just is, and then discard it the moment it's not. So, for example, we made one of our best calls of all time in December when, long before Mark Carney was a contract you could bet on Polymarket, we predicted correctly that not only would he replace Justin Trudeau before the election, but he would be a formidable candidate against the Conservatives with the help of the notoriously pliant media in Canada. And lo and behold, now he's the Prime Minister. We came to that prediction based on a mental model that we like to use, which is just make a wild assumption and then play it forward and look at the data and evidence and see whether or not that assumption is valid. And the wild assumption that we settled upon that led to that piece in late November was that Trump wanted Carney to be prime minister. And Trump didn't like the conservative candidate. And once you have that as an axiom against which you can measure the news flow and see how well it fits, we started to notice things. So once you have that as an axiom, the 51st state and Governor Trudeau talk makes sense. And so that's an example. But in our business, if you are, the only thing worse in our business than being wrong is having no opinion. And one of the things that we're always very careful to do is show our homework. Here's the link. Here's why. Here's why we think that. Here's evidence that would prove our theory wrong. And let smart, intelligent investors who subscribe to Doomberg use our work as an input to their grand mosaic, and maybe they make an investment decision or maybe they don't, but it's their portfolio and they're smart and they're independent and they're adults and they're capable of reading things that they might sometimes disagree with, as long as it's interesting and it's not polarizing and it's not too self-indulgent.
I love that. I love focusing. It's almost like a little bit of a process-based focus, like on like what we're talking about, what we can learn, what details can we extract, understanding the fact that it's a shifting world and coming up with like big macro views is really challenging. And literally any day there can be a completely new inject that shift everything.
100%. Look, we had made a call earlier in the year, for example, that we wrote a piece literally called "The U.S. is Not Broke." Then Liberation Day happened and threw the whole economic situation into a mess. And now we see the big, beautiful bill is, not exactly fiscally responsible. So while the U.S. is certainly not broke, even still, and the core arguments of that piece hold true, we're still heading towards being broke because of political choices and behaviors. And so our readers might look at that and say, well, you got that one wrong. And I would say, perhaps. But things change. And when you publish, 90 plus times a year, like we do, nobody bats 1,000. So one of the things we do is about every 3 or 6 months, once a quarter, a couple times a year, we'll just write a piece that looks back at 5 or 6 of our calls. And, we have a pretty good hit rate. The ones that were clearly right, the ones that were clearly wrong, and ones that were a little bit more nuanced, and just fess up to it. People love that. I think one of the problems with the mainstream media is arrogance. And there's, confidence is an absolute measure and arrogance is a relative one. And we're absolutely confident in our abilities and we're proud of our work. And, we measure ourselves against our own standard. And I think that comes through.
Yeah, I love that. It's funny too, because even more in like the trading side of the world where I exist, it's the same thing, right? Where everybody's so interested in trying to figure out who was right on this news headline. I always find it's missing the forest for the trees. And I
Oh,
like that process based. Each piece, regardless of what ends up happening, will have stuff in it that's usable, that
yeah.
provokes thought. I think that's awesome.
And look, in the trading world, 53% is amazing,
Sure.
right? You give me 53% success rate, I'll give you the bankroll management and we'll make millions. Um, and look, one of the things that is authentically true with everything we write is the moment we press send, everybody on the team 100% believes every word in that piece.
Hmm.
That's a moment in time. 5 minutes later, new information could come that radically changes our views. But the moment we press send, there is not a doubt that that is our best, most informed opinion. And the wonderful thing about Substack and the free market in general is every time we publish or every time we do a podcast appearance, um, our business depends on it. So if we get more things right, we get more subscribers, or we keep the ones that we have. And if somebody happens upon this podcast and says, "Wow, I that guest was interesting. Let me go and sign up for free and see what this is all about." Well, that's a pretty strong form of engagement, and they're more likely to end up subscribing. If somebody listens to this podcast and they hate what I say, they're unlikely to pay us. Um, and that's what the wonderful thing about the markets. Like we are 380 pieces into this, and we've lost no motivation for them whatsoever. Um, because we try to produce the very best product every time, and we wouldn't publish a piece if we weren't like I it's not quite achievable, but our objective is every piece is a candidate for the best piece we've ever written.
I see.
Yeah, we want it to be at that level,
Right.
and sometimes they just don't land. That's fine, but like there's no typos, very few typos. We we've we rigorously fact check as much as we can. There's nothing worse than getting a minor detail wrong in a story that collapses the credibility of the whole piece.
Right.
And it happens, but you get somebody's name wrong or you get a date wrong. Fact checking is actually much harder than you would think, especially when you're charging people. Like once we turned on the paywall, it just brought the business to a whole different level of responsibility for us. Like people are paying to consume this product, and that never leaves my mind. Like we're not going to just put garbage out. Like people are paying for this, and we're going to earn their business.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. And speaking of earning business, the US is trying to earn more manufacturing business. What do you make of the various arguments circulating around that? Some saying like this is good for these reasons, national security, bringing jobs. Other people say things like Americans don't want some of those jobs. So why would we bother bringing low skill jobs back? What's your opinion on trying to onshore more manufacturing?
Unabashedly 100% for it. Trump deserves full credit for trying to get it. The US and capital markets in general do a very poor job of pricing national security risk. And I think failed immigration policy has driven down the wages of such jobs to the point where Americans can't really make a living doing those jobs, at least compared to their neighbors. And I think Trump is mostly right on a lot of stuff. Um, I have some issue with some of Trump's tactics and some of Trump's language and some of Trump's social media posts. But I actually don't ever doubt his authenticity. And look, he's all the things everybody says he is, including his critics, right? Like, yes, Trump University was a scam. Like the same person who did Trump University was just treated like a king in the Middle East and worked tirelessly to bring trillions of dollars of foreign direct investment into the United States. I genuinely believe that Trump wants to catalyze a manufacturing renaissance, especially in the Midwest. And I live in the Midwest. I've seen the devastation and the consequences of financialization and globalization firsthand, participated in it when I was in corporate. Um, So all of those things are true, and also Trump coin is a scam. Right? I don't understand the valuation of Truth Social. I it's all of it is true, and I think it's okay to say that we can measure the man holistically. Do I think that it is ethically dubious that Don Jr. is going around the world and pumping various investments and foreign investors are currying favor directly or indirectly? I mean, how is that radically different than Hunter Biden? I don't really think it is, and Trump fans will get annoyed. I'm sorry if I'm going to trigger some people in your comments, but it's okay. Like the Washington D.C. is full of corrupt politicians, and so at least this one seems to be trying to do things for the working people. And I can tell you, I live in an area where Trump held a rally about 30 miles from where I live, and I decided to just drive around and get the vibe.
Hmm.
And like, because you're doing little uh, in-person recon, right? Nothing like boots on the ground and eyes on. And so shocking. There's no politician in the modern era that connects with regular people in the way Trump does. Um, and your view of that depends on your view of regular people. I happen to take the views of regular people seriously. What is Trump saying and doing that has caused this billionaire from New York, flamboyant billionaire from New York, to become their champion? Like, don't ignore that. Like, that's real. Um, and it's too flippantly brushed aside by the sort of coastal elites. And this Trump plays to this all the time. And then the last thing I'll say, Trump has a magic trick, which I must say Scott Jennings on CNN is the one who opened my eyes to this trick. He picks positions on really easy issues, 80-20 support in the country. And he takes the 80% side loudly. And all the Democrats who hate him so much viscerally, for whatever their justifications, they are forced to argue the 20% position. And he's just crushing them. Like over and over and over and over and over again. He's just crushing them. And so he's a talented person. And so when you see a mania, it's almost always on purpose. Again, it's not how I operate. My personality and Trump's personality, in between the two of us, is everybody else. But that's fine. Like, I'm capable of trying to objectively measure him.
So then, how does Trump is working for the average worker and trying to advocate for them, and the onshoring then of manufacturing jobs seemingly would be primarily to their benefit. Is that the broader idea?
Now, everyone in Trump's mind is going to benefit. If rich people are going to get really rich out of this, I mean, let's be honest. Um, you can't bring in $1 trillion of foreign money without a whole bunch of people on Wall Street and executives and investors and venture capitalists and private equity firms coming out way better than they were. Will some of it trickle down? I hope so. To your point, like, do people really want to do these jobs? I mean, I think they do. Many of them do. I mean, there's still a hardcore group of Americans who would like to provide for their family and are willing to do an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. But I don't kid yourself. I mean, if there's one thing the sort of moneyed class of the U.S. knows how to do is to catch money, and there's an awful lot of money coming in.
Before you'd mentioned crude oil and trying to drive oil down, one of the things I've been trying to understand a little bit better has been OPEC's stance on a lot of this, and they've seemed way more accommodating than I originally would have expected. How do you view their lens on what's going on?
Yeah, we've written a couple of pieces on this, and I think we've gotten this one mostly right. There was a deal cut. Look, whenever you have Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States sitting around negotiating with each other for weeks at a time, history tells us that when the three largest oil producers like that get together, whatever the headline reason is for them to be meeting is almost never really what it's all about. And so for weeks, we had the whole Ukraine thing. Talks were hosted in Saudi Arabia. We believe a broader, more consequential deal than just settling the war in Ukraine, which of course is very consequential, especially for those who live in Ukraine. Something else was going on, back channels. And I think A deal was cut. Who knows what was given in return? We have some speculations in that regard. But OPEC is suddenly doing Trump's bidding. I mean, let's just be honest.
Yeah.
And they're masking it as though they're punishing Kazakhstan for cheating. Cheating's been going on in OPEC forever. Who are we kidding? A deal was cut. And then after all of that, Trump goes to Saudi Arabia, and you just watch the footage. I'm sure you've seen it. Like, the Middle East is changing. And Trump, again, treated like a hero in the Middle East. Did you see the standing ovation he got when he announced that they were going to lift the sanctions on Syria, which is a whole other ball of wax? And the tsunami of cash committed to back Trump. I think a lot of it has to do with they want Trump to succeed. They want J.D. Vance to win in 28. They want what Trump is trying to do in America to work. And then there's a whole broader thought around Trump's civil war with the deep state. And Pippa Malmgren wrote a really fascinating piece. I wish I could remember the title. Basically saying that he's getting the help of these countries to stare down the deep state. And if you model the U.S. as currently being in a civil war, then all of this can make a lot more sense. Lord knows the CIA has messed around in the Middle East for an awful long time, and people are probably pretty tired of it over there. And look at what he's doing with Harvard in this regard. I have to give a hat tip to Mike Benz's great work on Twitter. I'm sure you follow it or you've seen it. The attack on Harvard, which some judge just issued a temporary restraining order nationwide already, hours later, to Trump's move to bar Harvard from accepting foreign students. That's actually an attack on the intelligence community because it's just part of their giant grift. So there's lots of ways we can go with that, but I'm just fascinated to watch all of it, like we've said. So,
what do you think the primary incentives would be for OPEC to want Trump and his policies to succeed?
Well, a unified Middle East, buffered from outside interference, and the forever wars, and the war with Iran, and the war in Syria. If they could settle all of that and be left alone to enjoy their riches, that's a prize worth suffering a few quarters of declining profits for. I honestly think that there's a deeper, again, when you look at how the dropping of the gold standard was covered in the 1970s, there's no talk of the petrodollar in the contemporary reporting of what was going on. There's something going on behind the scenes. We're not privy to it. But it's never what is being presented that's actually what's happening whenever you have momentous, decade shape-shifting type moves like we're seeing now. And so my hope, my suspicion, is that Trump has a grand plan of settling the war in Ukraine, driving peace in the Middle East, and reaching détente with China, cutting back on military spending in the long run because we don't need $1 trillion a year, and shepherding a U.S. manufacturing renaissance with all of the assets of the Western Hemisphere there for development. The Western Hemisphere is way more than self-sufficient, and I think the sort of multipolar world that Trump envisions, that is the U.S.'s sphere of influence, and I think that's the grand plan. And look, if he gets it done, they should give him a Nobel Peace Prize. 3 of them, but we'll see. Lots of people in the U.S. don't want any of those objectives to get done. So,
why do you think that is?
Well, war is a racket, and when you're in the bomb-making business, peace is a working capital problem. And I think much of U.S. foreign policy post-1970 oil embargo was shaped by the erroneous view that peak oil was real and the U.S. was running out of it. And so we went around the world in what amounts to resource wars. And the shale revolution has radically changed that. We're more than self-sufficient. We're net energy exporters. We refine way more finished products than we need. Yes, we have a mismatch between the type of oil that our refiners like to refine versus the type of oil that we are producing out of shale, all that will be fixed over time with investment. But by and large, the U.S. need not go abroad in search of resources anymore. It has more than enough to eat at home. And so that changing axiom hasn't really worked its way through the sort of State Department diplomatic class. And look, the giant grift machine that is DC is very lucrative. Every dollar of deficit spending ends up in the private sector pocket of somebody, right? There's a law of conservation of mass here, right? Like the dollars go somewhere. So if you have $1 billion jet program, well, there's a shareholder on the other end of that $1 billion investment. And so the system was working very well for a very small number of people. Those are the people that are going to be the most resistant to see that system change.
You'd mentioned earlier, touched on it quickly, but I always think it's worth discussing because I think the way it's been flowing has been very different than pretty much what everybody might have thought, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Obviously, Trump had talked about solving it essentially as soon as he got in, and then reality comes in. How do you think that's been progressing, and where do you think we go forward with respect to the conflict?
I don't think the conflict can be solved in any other way other than militarily. And the terms that Russia has been consistently laying out there have not changed and only get more aggressive with each square kilometer that the Russians occupy. They would say liberate. Ukrainians would say occupy. And I noticed with some interest overnight that Putin has declared that a new goal of the Russian army is to create a buffer zone in northern Ukraine in the Sumy region because of a wave of hundreds of drones that were fired at Moscow. And if you have hundreds and hundreds of drones fired at Moscow, well, you could see with each drone launched during that strike, more and more were getting through as the sort of early anti-missile defenses were being overwhelmed. And so probably, I think last reports I saw, like 60 out of 500 drones or so, and don't quote me, but made it into the Moscow area, which is quite alarming to the Russians and is going to provoke a response of pushing further back. Last time I was on the show, I made statements to the effect that I believe the war was lost and that it would be in Ukraine's interest to make peace. And I know that probably triggered some people because it's just not how the war is being reported in the West, in the Western legacy medias. The strongest proof I could say that validated my last appearance is that the winning side doesn't demand ceasefires. And which side is demanding a ceasefire right now? It's the NATO side. It's the Ukrainian side.
What makes you say that the winning side doesn't demand ceasefire?
The winning side has no need for a ceasefire. The winning side is fine to keep marching. It's right. Ukraine needs a pause to rearm, and they've been very, like Macron and Starmer have been very overt about this. Let's have an unconditional ceasefire, no restrictions on arms supply to Ukraine. We're going to fly in some British and French troops as tripwires, and then we're going to arm Ukraine to the teeth and give them a better chance to fight after the ceasefire. And the Russians have openly and consistently said, we're not going to play that game anymore. We've been fooled by that before. Now, again, no matter what your views are on the war, I'm just telling you, when you look at the area that the Russians are securing in the pace of area in May, which is, of course, they're getting out of the muddy season and, the tanks can now roll without getting stuck in the mud. They're going to go all in for a military victory. And absent a large appropriation from the U.S. Congress, which looks very unlikely. There was no talk of weapons for Ukraine in the big, beautiful bill. I don't know how it ends in any other way other than militarily. And, again, this session they had in Istanbul, was it? In Turkey, in Istanbul. I think the Russians took a tough line. And that it's not, look, it's a totally tragic situation. It was totally avoidable Trump is caught in a trap. He, I think, correctly believes that if he had won the 2020 election, there would not have been a war in Ukraine. Um, and so he doesn't feel like it's his war. But the US is a party to the war. So he can't really be a mediator because the moment the US stops supplying weapons and intelligence, it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to hold back the Russian army. The the heroic defense they've been able to put up has been underwritten by US weapons, US intelligence, US generals. And every day that Trump continues to provide that, which he is doing because he doesn't want to see sort of a Vietnam-style collapse, which is understandable, and the loss of the war would be pinned on him. But every day that he continues to provide those things, it becomes his war. And losing wars is hard. That's why you don't get into them. But anytime we talk about Ukraine, we annoy some people, and it is what it is. But I think we've been proven mostly right on what we've said. And like the information is all there, but you have to understand that every piece of information you're getting is propaganda, and you have to have a mechanism to read everybody's propaganda and then observe developments as they unfold and go back to the sources that predicted various things and see which one was mostly right. And then you sort of add more credibility weight to that source over time as they're more and more right. Last thing I'll say is almost no Western media outlets and very few consumers of news in the West actually read what the Russians are writing or listen to what they're saying to understand what their positions are. And if they did, they would probably have a different view. So I think it's okay to read both the Kiev Independent and TASS, the English versions of both of those. And this event happened. This is how the Ukrainians are describing it. This is how the Russians are describing it. Let's wait 3 or 4 days and see which side is more accurate. Sometimes the Russians are blatantly peddling disinformation. Not my favorite word, but and sometimes the Ukrainians are spreading propaganda. And sometimes it's the synthesis of the two that is probably right. So, for example, the whole reporting around the massive drone attack on Moscow was reported wildly differently between the Russians and the Ukrainians. You see that enough times. So, for example, if the Russians claim that every single drone was shot down and then you're seeing video footage of explosions along the path to Moscow, well, then, maybe that Russian Minister of Defense was fibbing a little bit. Okay, you have to put that in the back of your mind. And so, again, it's very hard, especially with war, because the closer you are to it, and the more emotional you get about it. And emotion is never good for objective analysis.
Couldn't have said it better. I think, and it's one of those conflicts that does have a lot to it that escapes a lot of more casual observers of it. Every time that I talk to some of my military friends and we're trying to dive deeper and deeper into it, you realize how tangled really that whole region is. But there's a lot of history. Look,
Viktor Orban of Hungary correctly described this as a Slovak civil war.
Right.
So I care a lot about your military buddies, right? And I have children of military age, draft eligible. And I also have friends in other countries, and I had a particularly close one from Canada during the whole Trump mania and the whole Orange Man bad stuff. And aren't you worried? No, I'm not worried. And we had a text exchange about Ukraine. Okay, so this guy's a firefighter. 2 kids, 2 boys. And I said, when did you begin to care about who rules the Russian-speaking part of the Donbass? And why do you care about it? It's like an honest question, right? And would you send your boys to go fight to decide who gets to rule the Russian-speaking part of the Donbass? And then I said, there's a war in the Congo right now. There's a civil war in the Congo right now. Thousands and thousands of people being killed every day. You never hear about it. Nobody cares about it. Why don't you care about the Congo? And would you send your boys to go fight in the Congo? Now, if you're in Russia or you're in Ukraine, that sounds like a cold way to view the question. But
Sure.
I'm not in Russia, I'm not in Ukraine, and neither are you, and neither are your military buddies. Um, so after 9/11, I understand why you're going to Afghanistan because the U.S. was attacked. Like that was a legitimate response. But the Russian-speaking part of the Donbass is part of some broader geopolitical game that the Europeans care much more about than we do. I don't know. I just don't get too excited about it. There's no. It's existential to Russia. It's obviously existential to Ukraine. It's geopolitically important to the U.S. to weaken Russia, I guess. Um, I don't know. I just when you read enough history and you do what we do, it's hard not to get cynical, openly confess to being cynical. I'm unabashedly isolationist. I think the Department of Defense should not be misconstrued as the Department of Proactive Offense. I think the US has amazing resources, economic potential, two oceans buffering us from hostilities. Nobody would ever dare attack us. Every home in the country has guns in it. Good luck occupying it. We're capable of defending ourselves. Let Europe defend Europe. That's sort of my view. And I know, some people are going to be sort of reacting negatively to that. But I think there's a lot more people. Like if you go to the back to the Joe Sixpack and white people, one of the reasons why Trump was so popular is because he had no wars. And he ran on that. There were no new wars started under Trump. He's proud of that. He correctly says there would not have been a war in Ukraine if he had won in 2020. Who has the war in Ukraine benefited? Not Ukraine. Arguably not the Russian soldiers who are dying. Certainly not the foreign mercenaries who are there, who the Russians are treating as though they don't have, the standards of rights, and they're killing them on the spot. It's a mess. It's a disaster. War's bad. War's terrible. War should be avoided. You need a strong military as a deterrent. But you don't deter by proactively getting entangled overseas. In my view, that's just my view.
It's fascinating. It really is really interesting to learn the 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 broader thought process behind the isolationist position and whatnot. And it's interesting. It really is interesting to me. A big thing you learn in the military are things like we call defense in depth and layering.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to to think about those two, right? Like how far is depth in the global scale? And obviously for the US, it's global.
Oceans. Yeah. But okay, but if you're Russia, so just let's do the analogy. Chinese gangs have set up shop in Mexico and are firing drones that are approaching Washington, D.C. How would the U.S. respond to that? Now, Ukrainians would say, well, they invaded Mexico in your scenario, and they're just fighting for their sovereignty. And all that's fine and true and justifiable. But the latest situation in India and Pakistan is a great example. Like J.D. Vance had the correct take on it. We would like to avoid civil war, but we don't care about this war to send American troops or to get involved militarily, right? There's always conflict in the world. The world's an ugly, dangerous, violent place, as you probably know way better than me, viscerally. Establish a high trust society at home and protect it. We have two oceans. Talk about layers. If China takes Taiwan, does that really meaningfully change your life? That's a civil war from the 40s, still being fought. Right? I mean, when you get entangled in foreign affairs, the founding fathers had this right, and we're putting a piece out on Tuesday on Estonia and the whole situation in the Gulf of Finland. And the piece is called Tripwire. Estonia is a country of 1.4 million people. It might come as a surprise to the small subset of the 335 million Americans listening to this podcast that you and I have an Article 5 obligation to defend Estonia. And Estonia is using a small subset of its 8 Navy ships in total to try to board and otherwise seize tankers containing Russian oil that is flowing through the EEZ in the Gulf of Finland. And are we really going to go to war? Because Estonia got a fighter jet, a Russian fighter jet buzzed the situation, and that caused the Estonian Navy to beat a hasty retreat. But there's pure escalation going on right now amongst the European quote unquote allies that is designed to trigger an Article 5 incident and rope the US into a broader conflict with Russia. Is that okay? Is that normal? Estonia is like 3/4 of the size of West Virginia and has 1.4 million people in it. And the US, because of NATO expansion, has agreed that if Estonia is attacked, it will go to war on behalf of Estonia. I don't think many Americans know that. George Washington famously warned about foreign entanglements, and Thomas Jefferson did the same. And we quote both of their cautions in the piece. Secure the homeland, engage in commerce, invest in a high trust society, education, good jobs, prosperity, cheap energy, the things that Trump talks about, whether he gets them, whether he means it. That's why he's popular. It's not the rich people who fight the wars, right? I mean, yes, I'm isolationist.
I don't know. There was a dude I saw in the barracks that had a Lamborghini, so his parents were pretty rich.
They must have been pissed at him.
It was one of the funniest things I've seen in my entire life, because like the enlisted Marines, when they're junior, they have to be in the barracks and they have all this stuff, right, that you have to have. And the dude's like trying to figure out how to put his kit like in a Lamborghini to take to go drive where he has to go to like start a hike. He's trying to figure out where to put this pack because it doesn't fit in the trunk. Awesome.
Well, he's truly the exception that proves the rule.
Very much.
That he was so memorable shows you how rare he was.
Oh, it's so comical. Now, you were talking a little bit earlier about energy, cheap energy. We know you and I have spent a while talking about nuclear power, how important that is to this. Obviously, Trump has come out recently with some updates on his policies towards nuclear energy. What do you think of those?
Yeah, we're waiting for the formal executive orders that could drop any minute and might even drop before you publish this podcast. We wrote a piece yesterday called Actuarial Examinations, where reading the tea leaves as we try to do, we believe that what's going to happen is that the US military is going to be leveraged to circumvent civilian obstacles to the deployment of nuclear reactors to power artificial intelligence data centers. I think you're going to see Google and Facebook and NVIDIA setting up on military campuses, leveraging the Defense Production Powers Act or whatever it's called, and basically stripping the NRC of the ability to block, impede, or otherwise veto the development of safe nuclear power, while Trump sets about the task of gutting the NRC and rebuilding it back in his image. And I think he and Chris Wright and Doug Burgum and the whole American Energy Dominance Committee knows inherently that the NRC has been the logjam. And we talked about why that is in that piece. We can get into it if you'd like. But to cut the Gordian knot, Pete Hegseth is going to unstick U.S. nuclear energy. And if you'd have told me when we started Doomberg that my favorite Fox and Friends weekend host was going to be the catalyst for unsticking U.S. nuclear energy, I could hardly have believed you. But to be fair and to be clear, I have great respect for Pete Hegseth. I think he has done his tours of duty. He's an American hero. He's a smart, intelligent, handsome, intelligent, looks great on TV, all the things Trump likes. And if he can do it, God bless him, he will have carved out a legacy far superior to his predecessors. So I do think it is shameful how Hegseth's military service is minimized and his lack of quote unquote qualifications for the job by the traditional elite measurements is continuously highlighted by those who oppose him or oppose Trump. And you only need look at how the troops respond to him when he works out with them in the morning to get a true understanding of the leadership potential of Pete Hegseth.
It's really interesting because the military is an institution that obviously highly values hierarchy, but one of the largest complaints you'll hear from military members is often how that hierarchy just slows everything down. to a snail's pace in terms of innovating, trying new ideas.
Uh,
So
Look,
it's
the bureaucracy chokes out innovation, and there's no bigger bureaucracy than the Pentagon. I can only tell, like, Doomberg's a very small team. You can count the contributing members of Doomberg on one hand with multiple fingers left over. Um, and we joke internally that if we hired 10 people, we'd be 50% as productive in total because you spend all your time managing the 10 people. Like, it's okay to just do things yourself. Right? Like, just go and do. Don't ask. Um, don't. The last thing you want to do is get an opinion of a lawyer, um, right? Like, lawyers advise and leaders decide. Go. Like, point, pull the trigger. Like, this is why, by the way, like, again, I've never been in the military. I read a lot of military history, and I have a lot of respect for people that have been in the military. Um, Pushing power to the field commander level is always better than
Mhm.
headquarters, right? Um, and so, like, the lowest rank, and when I was an executive, I always tried to do this. Um, when I was leading large teams, and you have what's called span of control. Like,
Mhm.
so as I'm sure you know, um, very similar in corporate world as to the military, except there's less death. How many people can a manager actually manage? And um, how many layers between you and the field? And all of my conversations with my leaders as I grew up the corporate chain was here's your accountability, here's your control. Let's start by describing both of those and make sure that there's no mismatch. Because there's nothing worse than having more accountability than you have control because you can't complete the mission. And if you have more control than you have accountability, that's not so good either. So my goal was always clear goal writing and matching accountability with control. You have the authority to hire, to fire, to promote, to develop. Um, but this is the subset of decisions I need to be consulted on. It's a classic RACI chart: responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. And if you spell that out and you have good leaders and you trust them, and their success is theirs and their failures are ours. And if you know that your leadership has that mindset, then they will do wonders for you. It's got to be the same thing in the military. I'm sure this is very familiar to you. When you have to go back to the Pentagon for every decision, and you see the consequences of that decision is not just money lost, it's your friend died. That's very bittering, I would assume. And so, I think back to Hegseth, like, the way in which he was treated after being nominated was shameful.
I feel like it's the standard thing, right? Everybody's trying to figure out what they can try to poke holes in, no matter what the resume is. So standard fare.
Yeah, but they didn't do that to Rubio because he's a senator and he's a member of the club. So it's not always that
Mhm.
way.
Going back to energy, what's something that you would consider to be like a current state underappreciated risk with respect to just the energy supply chain?
Risk to supply or risk to price, because they're the opposite side of the
I would say
equation.
to the supply chain, to the actual provision.
Yeah. War in the Middle East, obviously, but that's widely appreciated. I think terrorism against choke points. Um, a well-informed bad actor could do significant damage to the global economy with a very, very small repertoire of weapons. I'm guessing that almost nobody listening to this podcast has ever heard of the words Ras Tanura before. Probably you haven't.
I
Um,
definitely have not. I have no
yeah,
idea.
Ras Tanura is home to the world's most important energy production site, tiny island of Qatar.
Okay.
um, Qatar produces, an enormous amount of natural gas that ends up on ships, most of it, and is fed to places like Japan, Korea, Europe now. Um, and it's a very small area in the middle of the Middle East, well within the Houthis' range. And it wouldn't take much in the way of a concerted effort to destroy that facility, to disrupt the global economy. There's a, two pipelines that connect Russia to Turkey that Russia has accused, and I think Turkey has quietly agreed, Ukraine has been trying to blow up. The Nord Stream pipeline, I think, was a catastrophe. exploding that pipeline was a disaster because it normalizes the wanton destruction of critical energy infrastructure. And once we go down that road, a lot of ugly outcomes. So all the land pipelines connecting Russia to Europe no longer flow gas, and Nord Stream no longer flows gas, and three of the four pipelines are blown up. There are two large pipelines that connect Russia to Turkey that then go on to feed gas to places like Hungary and Slovakia and Italy and broader Europe. And if we wake up one day and you hear that either Turk Stream or Blue Stream has been damaged or destroyed in a terrorist attack, all bets are off. The thing about energy is um, you gain efficiency at scale, and scale necessarily means concentration, and you have concentrated risks. And so I think terrorism is look, it could happen in the U.S. You know, Freeport LNG had a mysterious explosion shortly after the whole Nord Stream affair, and there was a lot of rumors that maybe this was, Russian cyber attack. That, who knows? Back to propaganda and disinformation. You start taking out LNG export terminals, suddenly you're going to flood the U.S. with LNG and, or sorry, with natural gas, and it's going to stint oil production and all kinds of issues. And so um, that's a big risk. I think the long-term consequences of the Nord Stream attack hold the potential to be severe. And when countries get desperate, and look, Ukraine is desperate, understandably so. Losing wars is hard. If it's existential, you're willing to do anything. And so there was an attack on the Turk Stream, one of the Turk Stream compressor stations that apparently the Russian air defense system managed to knock out. If that attack had been successful, ironically, the Europeans would have been in a world of hurt. Now, it's summertime, the risk is a little bit less. You see that pipeline go out in November, it's a whole different story.
This is probably a pretty ignorant question, but I'm curious about it. In the world of nuclear power adoption, what kind of role do you think I think is a little easier to wrap your arms around the potential impact. But what about something like quantum computing, which is a little further off? Is there any tie-ins from your lens with respect to those two systems and how it can impact? I'm mostly thinking nuclear, but maybe energy more broadly.
So the cutting edge of computing, the very cutting edge of computing, while it's being developed, doesn't actually need that much energy and is willing to pay effectively anything for it. So I don't think that the development of quantum computing is tied to a rollout of nuclear energy, for example. But I think AI will certainly help the development of quantum computing, and AI is about to transform, I mean, everything. A really scary piece today on a Substack I read. A friend of mine authors it, Elgato Mato. He wrote a piece about how the internet is going to be unusable in a year, right? And I don't want to take a quantum computing question and turn it into the internet's going to be unusable in a year, but it's what I'm thinking about today, right? And so, AI in general is a derivative of energy. And AI, like what we're seeing now, is not the cutting edge research of AI. It's just being deployed. It's very cutting edge compared to standard computing. I'm a firm believer. I'm participating in the private markets. I'm sold. But to the specific question, I mean, quantum computing research is real. It's being pursued. The Chinese are just as far advanced, if not further, than we are. And Kurzweil is going to be proven right.
What do you think of the other way? Do you think that there's an impact that the advancement of AI and or quantum computing can have on the future of energy?
Yeah, in the short term, it is bullish for demand. And in the intermediate term, it's bullish for supply. But there is going to be a gap. And I happened to interview a CEO of a nuclear startup for a private meeting at the request of a friend, which I'm always happy to do. And he was telling me about the demand forecast just in Texas. Um, they need another grid in the next 8 years, and they have no track record of materially growing the grid.
What's Could you help me? I don't understand the scale of that. It sounds big, but I don't know how to
Yeah.
yeah.
So if they have 80 gigawatts of installed capacity today, they need 200
Oh, I
to
see.
meet
Okay.
future demand. Just unbelievable numbers.
Right.
To the point where you're going to run out of gas turbines, and there's a shortage of those, and you're going to run out of transformers, and there's a shortage of those. And this is why we believe that a piece we wrote last year will prove prescient. The piece was called Irreconcilable Differences, where we predicted that AI is incompatible with the grid. Why? Um, the grid is useful to society, incredibly so, but only if it's at least 3 nines reliable and cheap. Um, you can't put AI into the existing culture and architecture that we use to build, maintain, and manage the grid and succeed with the speed that AI demands without radically driving the price higher, which crushes everybody in society, especially Joe Sixpack. So this is why I think distributed SMRs, natural gas goes in one side, data comes out the other, fission happens on one side of the building and data comes out the other, is the solution where you don't have to worry about grid connections. You aren't creating demand because like these companies will pay way more than you and I like to pay or industry likes to pay for its electricity. And we need you and I and we need industry because ultimately AI is supposed to be in service of us and not the other way around. Um, so uh, I think that's the trend. Doesn't mean that the friction of the transition from where we are on, the trajectory we're on today to that realization isn't going to be, let's say, interesting.
Mm. I know that we're at time. I had one more question if you have a moment.
Sure.
Yeah, awesome. I'll keep it quick. When we're looking out over the rest of the year and you're thinking of the interplay of literally everything that's going on today, like if you were to pick 2 or 3 primary themes you're most interested in for the remainder of the year, what are those?
Yeah. Um, Trump's response to Russia's continuation of the war in Ukraine, um, whether Trump falls into the trap of going to war in Iran, and whether Trump can achieve a détente with China over the Taiwan issue. And if he um, succeeds in avoiding escalation, especially in the last two, um, he will be a pretty consequential president, in my view. And I think, Trump is kind of like the last person I spoke to kind of guy. Like if you get Trump, he's gonna he's a people person. He's very high EQ, right? And so he just spent a lot of time in the Middle East and got noticed that he didn't stop in Israel, which was interesting. Um, so that's what I'm watching. If we go to war in Iran, I think it'll sink his presidency. I think he knows that intuitively. There's a lot of people in Washington want to go to war in Iran, and many of them work in his administration. So, Russia, Ukraine is it is Biden's war, and Trump's at least trying to end it. And you could plausibly say that it wasn't really his fault. But if Iran happens, that's him. And if China happens, that's him. And war is always a failure of diplomacy, and it would be Trump's failures. And so I quite literally pray that he navigates the situations and avoids conflict.
Really interesting. Very last one, I promise. If you were to attach a probability to those different outcomes, how are you weighing the odds?
Odds are that Trump's going to walk away from Ukraine.
Okay.
And the narrative will be the sort of classic stab in the back narrative, and it'll be Trump's fault that Ukraine collapsed. And if only we the U.S. had shipped more weapons or given more intelligence or held on longer, the Russian economy would have collapsed. And history will decide all of that. I think Trump is pretty fed up with that whole situation and wants to wash his hands of it. I give it 80-20 cuts a deal with Iran, and 60-40 cuts a deal with China. That's my just gut. You asked me a question on my feet. That's my gut.
Yeah, of course. We'll get it on Polymarket and then we'll see how it goes.
Uh,
As
Love it.
always, It's honestly so fun hanging out, chatting with you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and thank you for just sharing stuff for people to noodle, right? Like we talk about before the podcast. The goal isn't to say things that people like or dislike. It's to talk about things as they are and then let people noodle on it, right? And think.
And admit when you're wrong. Yeah. And look, I mean, if we wanted to create a clickbait newsletter, I know how to do that. It's not what we're in for. So I always appreciate our conversations. They're serious, they're intellectual, they're stimulating, and always look forward to coming back on, and always happy to see a request to do so hit our inbox.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for hanging out.
Yep. See ya.